used to be said that the sun never set on the British Empire, a vast array of territories acquired by conquest and treaty. For more than 100 years, Britain grew rich on the profits of empire. But in the early 20th century, things began to change. By the 1920s, the Dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand, dominated by white settlers, were becoming increasingly independent from British rule. The colonies in Africa, Asia and the Pacific were governed directly by a small number of British administrators, relying on imperial power and prestige. These keepers of the king's peace believed fiercely in their own superiority. For them and their subjects, the word of the district commissioner was law. This was the world portrayed in British imperialist films in the 1930s. Sanders of the River was set in a British colony in Africa. The local African king has been summoned to a palaver or meeting with the British district commissioner. Some of the king's warriors have been caught stealing women for slaves. The king is particularly angry with a rival African chief, Bosambo, who has betrayed him to the British. Throughout the meeting, Bosambo sits on the ground beside Commissioner Sanders.
King Mafalaba, I called you to palaver, but I didn't call your warriors.
Lord Sandy, a dog of a little chief, chopped the captain of my guard.
Your captain heard my orders, but he didn't obey them.
Lord Sandy, you promised we should keep our custom. It's an old custom in our lands to buy women.
Yes, if the woman and the father consent. But slavery I will not have, King Mafalaba.
My fathers ruled these lands for 300 years. I'm the greatest king in these countries.
My king is the greatest king on earth. And if little kings and chiefs disobey his orders, I plough them into the ground.
What do you want, Sandy?
You will take your spears back to your own country. And for the blood of your captain, I will send back your warriors who are in my prison.
I will do as you want me, Sandy, because I am your friend. But I have 9 war drums, over which are stretched the skins of little chiefs who offended me. I know the skin that will be stretched on the tent.
If you touch one servant of the government, be it so little as a pigeon, then believe me, King Mafalaba, you won't be king any longer. The palaver is finished.
Men like Commissioner Sanders represented the British monarch. In the 1920s, the King Emperor, George V, sent his son on many long imperial tours. The Prince of Wales's travels were filmed by the newsreel companies of the day and shown in cinemas before the main film. Part travelogue, part empire propaganda, the films gave the people back home in Britain the impression of a united empire. The prince was shown receiving an enthusiastic welcome wherever he went. In Africa, he was greeted as a great chief. And in India, the full pomp and ceremony of empire was put on display. The prince's role was to promote trade within the empire and to thank the dominions and colonies for their support during the First World War. He shook so many hands on one trip that his right hand was bruised and he had to use his left. Despite the prince's efforts, by 1930, British exports were facing stiff competition. For the first time, documentary filmmakers were commissioned by the Empire Marketing Board to promote the Imperial Trade Network, presenting it as good for Britain and good for the Empire.
What a lot of things for a pudding.
In this film, a young boy is inspired by a window display showing the King's Christmas pudding.
The King's Christmas pudding. What a lot of lovely things.
He dreams of going to Buckingham Palace to find out more about where these ingredients come from. At the palace, he is introduced to helpful representatives of the Dominions.
India, sir. Canada, sir.
What can we do for you? We'll do anything you want.
They guide him on his way around the Empire.
Mine is a land of sun and fruit. Look at those
Here,
valleys
they
shaded by
transport him to
high
South
mountains.
Africa to see the grapes and oranges used in making brandy.
Little South African boy like you is eating grapes, picked from his father's vineyard.
This was an early form of advertising, shown in the cinemas before the days of television commercials. A vital factor in the Empire's prestige was its ability to defend itself from attack. At times of war, Britain expected support from all its dominions and colonies. The Second World War was an imperial war, although many Indians were outraged that Britain should declare war on their behalf without even consulting them. The growing pressure for independence meant that colonial loyalty could not be taken for granted. It had to be encouraged. This propaganda film was made in 1941 for the Ministry of Information in London by an Indian company, Bombay Talkies.
The Indian soldier, linking his old fighting tradition to his membership of a mighty empire, rises to the occasion as he has done during the past and will do in the future. Weapons and methods of warfare change with changing times, but the Indian adapts himself to new methods as he participates in the struggle for freedom and democracy. Thanks to army training, these Indian soldiers, Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, live not as Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, but as Indians who are proud to be members of a great commonwealth. We Indians are proud of our brothers who are fighting in Africa. Under the magnificent leadership of General Wavell, take part in the conquest of Libya. There'll be more than a match for Mussolini's men. Our humble services in Africa have proved it. They are used to a rough life, and a few knocks make little difference.
Another film for the Ministry of Information shows the contribution to the war effort of British territories in the Caribbean.
And attached to one of our own fighter squadrons is Sergeant Pilot Jimmy Hyde, who himself comes from Trinidad. He is reporting back from an operational flight. Hardly any of us had experience of flying before the war. The air routes between the islands were mainly run by the Americans. When peace comes, the increase in air transport should mean a new career for many of us who have now learned the job. Lance Corporal Williams belongs to British Guiana, and she is in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps. She retreads tires in an army workshop.
This film emphasises the benefits of cooperation for a better future after the war is won.
These are some of the jobs we are doing. Together with others from the British Commonwealth of Nations, with men and women from the rest of the United Nations, West Indians are fighting for the new world that we all want to see. In Hyde's squadron, there are pilots from New Zealand, Poland, Britain and Canada. Friendships are being made between people who, before the war, knew little or nothing about each other, and we find it impossible to believe that these friendships will just fade out when the war is won.
The Second World War exposed the many weaknesses of the empire. Unable to defend its distant territories in Southeast Asia, Britain's prestige was shattered by Japanese victories. When at the beginning of 1942, Singapore's garrison of 130,000 fell to a smaller Japanese force, the myth of invincibility was gone forever. The Japanese claimed to be fighting a war of liberation, freeing Asia from European imperialism. This newsreel captures their moment of triumph.
2月15日午後、一日中吠え続けた両軍の砲声はピタリと止んだ。杉田参謀の出迎えを受けて、イギリス軍司令官パーシバル中将らが折からの落日を浴びながら白旗を掲げて歩いてくる。一行は会見の場所フォード工場に向かう。山下中将は日本軍としてはイギリス軍の無条件降伏のみに応ずると第一声を放つ。イエスかノーかお答え願いたい。答えはイエスであった。
This film made much of the large numbers of captured colonial and Dominion troops who had fought for the King Emperor.
思いを馳せるイギリス兵のありやなしや、その多くは祖国をもただるインド兵、マレー兵の無理やり英国に駆り立てられた姿であった。
Prime Minister Churchill was determined to hold on to as much of the empire as possible. However, to regain its territories in Southeast Asia, Britain would have to rely on American assistance. But the Americans, who had fought for their own independence nearly 200 years before, were anti-British imperialism. This critical point of view is reflected in an American cinema newsreel of 1944. While attempting to give a balanced view of India, the film reveals American distaste for British colonial rule.
Protected by tariffs which have often worked to Britain's disadvantage, India has climbed to 8th place among the world's industrial nations. Yet the Indians have felt that for all it has accomplished, British rule has been the rule of a conqueror, administered primarily for the empire's good and only secondarily for theirs. They have resented reactionary Britishers who, in defiance of a policy favoring greater equality and more independence, sought to keep the Indians in an inferior social and economic status.
After the war, the new Labour government was in favour of Indian independence. Early in 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the King's cousin, was appointed Viceroy to manage the transition from British to Indian rule. Having secured independent Dominion status for India, Mountbatten stayed on briefly as Governor-General.
The scene in Delhi was typical of hundreds of towns throughout the vast territory that was about to become the Dominion of India. Cows, being held sacred by the Hindus, are never driven off the pavements, and all the familiar activities to be witnessed in this teeming city were being carried on as usual. But there was an undercurrent of pent-up excitement, for everyone knew that India, Hindustan India, was now to be free and independent. At midnight, the actual transfer of power took place. The assembly was addressed by the President, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, and the Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru. Next day, huge crowds again assembled, this time outside Government House. They wanted to see the important leaders arrive for today's big ceremony. Sardar Patel, Minister of Law. Sardar Baldev Singh, Minister of Defence. And from the roof, Pandit Nehru surveys the vast throng, which was so great that it held up the arrival of the principal personality. Indeed, the Bengal Lancers escorting Lord and Lady Mountbatten had considerable difficulty in making a lane through the hundreds of thousands of people gathered there. The occasion was the swearing in of Lord Mountbatten as Governor-General of the Dominion of India. The fact that the ex-Viceroy was to hold the office is itself a great tribute to his work for the Indian people. As further evidence of the popularity of the Governor-General and his wife, there are these scenes of their attendance in the afternoon at a sort of children's fete, where sweets were distributed and a number of entertainments presented.
This optimistic newsreel makes no mention of the tragic aftermath of partition. Against a background of violence between the opposing forces of Muslims and Hindus, British and Indian leaders accepted that the price of independence was a division into two countries. India for the Hindus and a new country for the Muslims comprising West Pakistan and East Pakistan, later Bangladesh. Thousands died in the massacres that followed partition, and millions were uprooted from their homes. British newsreels still seem to suggest that civilized behavior was only possible under British rule.
Curfew is imposed in Delhi as communal hatred reaches fever pitch. The uneasy marriage of Muslim and Hindu has turned back the pages to one of the grimmest eras in India's history. Muslims found refuge in a Delhi mosque. Casualties from the rioting in the capital were more than 1,000. The novelty of independence has worn thin. More Indians have been killed in the past month than in all the riots during the past 50 years. As the massacre went on, the East was wistfully saying goodbye to the reign of the British.
Within 20 years of India and Pakistan achieving independence, a large part of Britain's remaining empire was dismantled. It was transformed into the new Commonwealth, a multiracial global organization of self-governing countries. The days of empire were over.
In 1954, about 10,000 West Indians came to Britain. In 1955, it is believed another 15,000 will make the long journey. Already their coming has caused a national controversy, but one point must always be borne in mind. Whatever our feelings, we cannot deny them entry, for all are British citizens and, as such, are entitled to the identical rights of any member of the empire. Now the end of their journey is near. What will they find in the land they regard as an El Dorado?
In post-war Britain, the streets were not paved with gold, but there were jobs on offer, and as a legacy of imperialism, a quarter of the world's population could claim the right to live and work in Britain. A British passport may have opened the door, but it was no guarantee of a warm welcome. Workers from Britain's former colonies in Asia, the West Indies and Africa met increasing racial prejudice as British immigration policy moved from openness to control, balanced by attempts to outlaw discrimination. For centuries, migrant workers had joined the country's workforce, and from 1948, West Indians arrived in increasing numbers, encouraged to take jobs in transport and healthcare. This 1962 cinema documentary looks back positively at West Indian job prospects in the 1950s.
As most of the West Indies live by agriculture, the majority who've come to Britain are unskilled for industry, so jobs present a major problem. Officials are sympathetic, but fitting people into the right kind of jobs can take time. London Transport has a highly successful scheme which recruits bus conductors from Barbados, one of the West Indian islands. Candidates are chosen on the island, and some 200 of them come to Britain every year to join London's bus conductor force of more than 14,000 men and women. Some get promotion to driving, perhaps to team up with a fellow countryman. While other West Indians also help to keep the transport services moving. A hospital in Britain without a West Indian nurse has become an exception. These district nurses work in Hackney, a small group of the 4,000 West Indian nurses in England alone.
Despite their contribution in the workplace, black migrants were seen to present a problem out of proportion to the numbers arriving. This racial discrimination was the result of prejudice, known then as the colour bar. The newly launched television current affairs programme Panorama set out to expose prejudice, confronting it at a local level in British railways.
Is there any colour bar on British railways?
No, there is no colour bar on British railways. On no part of British railways.
This is Mr. Davis, the goods agent in charge of Smithfield Depot. How many vacancies have you at the moment?
It's 9 vacancies for staff at the moment.
In what sort of jobs?
Principally in porters' jobs.
Next day at Lambeth, I met 4 unemployed Jamaicans. They had been looking for work for weeks. So I suggested that they should go to Smithfield to ask for the porters' jobs which the manager had said were vacant. They went there on Thursday morning. They were turned down.
I went to the manager and asked for if he needed any porter. He told me that there was no vacancy for no porter.
I went straight back to Mr. Davis for another interview. Now, Mr. Davis, you have vacancies here.
Oh, yes.
But now, 4 coloured men came this morning to ask for jobs and they were turned away. Now, officially, the policy is that there's no colour bar.
There is a general reluctance by men to work with these coloured chaps, particularly when the jobs are such that they are not in the initial grades necessarily, and the men require specific training for jobs.
I put much the same questions to a leading member of the Railwaymen's Union at Smithfield, Mr. Geary. Now, why is it that there is a prejudice here against coloured men?
Oh, there's no prejudice, Mr. Chataway.
Why is it that they're not taken, then?
Well, it's the type of job done at a particular depot, you see. The speed is the question at a particular station, speed. And we feel that the colour man is apt to work at one particular space, and also there is this much about the coloured man. The staff feel that they are apt to lose their temper and resort to tactics that the average white man would not resort to.
Have you ever worked with a coloured man?
No, I haven't.
The often painful process of adapting to life in Britain could be made easier by a shared passion for sport. But as this film reveals, belief in fair play didn't extend beyond the cricket ground. A West Indian cricket fan is shown looking for a room to rent.
This man was a friendly face among you, mixing freely with the crowd which a cricket game had brought together. He shared cigarettes and a scorecard with an English couple who sat beside him. He was neat, clean, wholly acceptable as your neighbor. And now he has chosen this street to ask about the single rooms which some owners have advertised for rent.
I've heard that you've got rooms going, and I
have got a room, but I'm afraid I can't let you in.
Beg your pardon?
I can't let you in. I've got 14 English boys in here.
14 English boys? So you don't want...
I can't mix. I'm ever so sorry, I wouldn't sell, but if I let you come in, all my boys would leave.
If you let me come in...
If I let you come in, all the other ones would go.
Yes. Okay,
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's
There is nothing wicked in the look of these faces. Behind closed doors, they will resume their habit of loving the animal world. A sick kitten can reduce the toughest of them to tears. But a black face allows any excuse for refusing the citizen his request for shelter. In cricket, he might have been a name which entertained the nation. But on this street, such admiration comes to an end with its applause. Is he student, worker, or politician in the making? This journey is remembered by each alike as the longest and loneliest in his London's experience.
Racial tension in areas of poor housing and overcrowding had led to serious riots in 1958. The black community in Nottingham and in London's Notting Hill bore the brunt of white resentment.
Something new and ugly raises its head in Britain. In Notting Hill Gate, only a mile or two from London's West End, racial violence. An angry crowd of youths chases a Negro into a greengrocer's shop, while police reinforcements are called up to check the riot, one of many that have broken out here in a few days. The injured victim, a Jamaican, is taken to safety. But the police have not been able to reach all the trouble spots so promptly, and the quietest street may flare up at any moment. Most disturbing feature of the riots is the suspicion that not all the troublemakers are locals. Some of the gangs who break windows or throw bottles or burning torches have arrived by car. Opinions differ about Britain's racial problems, but the mentality which tries to solve them with coshes and broken railings has no place in the British way of life. This violence is evil, and the law and public opinion must stamp it out.
In 1962, prompted by fear of a dramatic increase in immigration and the emergence of black and Asian districts in London and the Midlands, the first post-war immigration controls were introduced. The Act brought in a quota system with labour vouchers. The exclusion of the Irish from the quota system led to accusations that blacks and Asians were being subjected to a legal colour bar. Those already in the country found themselves balancing their own customs and culture with the everyday process of integration.
Bradford, a city of textile mills, has 12,000 Pakistani immigrants, and nearly all of them work in the mills.
This portrayal of Pakistanis living in Bradford was narrated by an Asian woman who acknowledged the tensions between old and new lifestyles.
These men are Pathans who come from the northwest frontier between Pakistan and Afghanistan. By living together, they are to some extent recreating their village life at home. Very few of them have brought their wives, so they cook and fend for themselves. Marriages are arranged for bachelors living in Bradford by their families at home. The mother of this baby was married in Pakistan by telephone to a distant relative living in Bradford.
Of £6, in addition to a decimal part of £6,
Co-education breaks the traditions of centuries for Pakistanis coming to Britain. The younger generation is learning a different way of life from their parents.
In the case of number 3, then, I want you to do it in this...
We need not lose our identity completely. But I'm sure if we are going to make ourselves more acceptable to the society here and have good relations with them, we'll have to readjust ourselves and try to know their point of view as well. And that could perhaps eliminate any misunderstanding, if there is any.
The Pakistani girl in this gym wears the same clothes as other girls in her school, but changes into traditional dress at home. She lives in two worlds. Which will she and others of her generation choose when they grow up?
In the mid-60s, attempts were made to legislate against discrimination in public places, but the law didn't yet apply to housing or employment. It was the start of a political balancing act, helping integration on the one hand, while limiting the numbers of future immigrants. White resentment and prejudice were becoming a feature of local politics, particularly in the Midlands. In 1964, the issue of housing was the focus for dispute in the Smethwick area of Birmingham. The local Conservative councillor was asked for his opinion.
Well, we feel that the influx into Smethwick has reached saturation point, and we don't want to aggravate the problem any further.
Many people say that people in Smethwick, like yourself, are showing extraordinary colour prejudice, which is bad for the whole country, not just Smethwick.
Well, that is complete nonsense, of course. There is no colour prejudice as such. There is prejudice against people living in overcrowded and insanitary conditions.
But why is it only the coloured people that you seem to worry about?
Because the conditions complained of seem to arise mainly amongst the coloured immigrant population. If the same conditions arise elsewhere, they would be dealt with in the same manner.
What are you doing positive in Smethwick to help coloured people?
A more extreme form of racism emerged in the mid-60s with the creation of the National Front, which campaigned for the repatriation of blacks and Asians. They echoed the views of Enoch Powell, MP for Wolverhampton, who was waging a parliamentary campaign to stop immigration.
Well, I'll be able to acknowledge it to you. Thank you.
But Powell went too far for his Conservative colleagues. In April 1968, while Parliament was debating tougher laws against discrimination, Powell threatened terrible consequences if immigration continued unchecked.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
Powell's inflammatory remarks hit the headlines. He had strong popular support from certain quarters.
88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell. 88% Slough people.
For his outspoken views, Powell was sacked from the Conservative shadow cabinet and forced into political isolation. Earlier that same year, a crisis in government immigration policy was triggered by fear of a mass migration of Asians from Kenya. They had been deprived of their livelihood by Kenya's Africanization policy. As British passport holders, they had the right to live and work in Britain. The British government's reaction was to try to push the doors shut, effectively making over 100,000 Kenyan Asians stateless. This current affairs programme for ITV, filmed in Kenya, reveals the consequences of the British government's hasty action. Local Asians with their British passports felt betrayed by the mother country. Thousands tried to beat the ban, leaving everything behind to fly to England.
Last week, over 8,000 Asians were airlifted out of Embakasi.
Another 100,000 all British subjects were left behind in Kenya. With increasing bitterness, they will remember last Friday as the day that Britain said no entry to her Asian citizens. Nairobi Market has always been a stronghold of the Asian traders. It's a good example of the Africanization which is gradually squeezing the Asians out. Barely 3 months ago, nearly all the stalls were owned and managed by Asians who employed African labour. But today there are only a handful of Asians left. The rest have lost their licenses, which have now been allocated to Africans. What has already happened here in the market is expected to happen soon to most of the Asian-owned shops in Kenya. But this is not simply racial discrimination by Africans against Asians. Although many Asians were born in Kenya, they're foreigners there. At the time of independence, they were given the choice of becoming Kenyan citizens or remaining subjects of Britain. Most chose the devil they knew and stayed British. It wasn't a fear of losing their property or their job in Kenya which sent sensible men fleeing down the road to Embakasi Airport last week. They saw Britain's Parliament taking away from them a far more basic human right, the right to belong. The dark blue British passport, which was clutched in every hand, was to them more than just a travel document. It was a guarantee of their nationality, a token of their belief that the British government would honour the promise it contained. Many of them pointed out that on the inside cover, Her Britannic Majesty pledged that the bearer could travel freely without let or hindrance. But now the British government was in effect adding the words, but not to Britain and not if you're brown. These people are not poor and unskilled like many of the Asians from India and Pakistan already in Britain. Their intention was not to swap the sunny highlands of Kenya for the smoky and overcrowded terraces of the Midlands and north of England. These are the people who responded in panic to what seemed to them to be prejudice. Britain had ratted on an obligation and they wanted to get out rather than risk being caught in the squeeze of growing Africanization and mounting barriers in Britain.
Over the next 20 years, immigration control was tightened even further. To balance this, in 1976, the government passed still tougher legislation to outlaw discrimination. Although this is one of the most powerful laws of its type in Europe, racial prejudice still rears its ugly head in the United Kingdom.
That everything good was white and everything bad was black. For an example, Jesus Christ, we see a white man. The angels, we see white. The Lord's Supper, we see white. Miss America, we see white. Miss Universe, we see white. Miss World, we see white. Even Tarzan in the jungles of Africa, we see a white man ruling Africa. All you good cowboys in your Western Road white horses. The president stays in a White House.
The American Declaration of Independence asserts that all men are created equal, that every citizen has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But black Americans have had to struggle for equality. Freed from slavery in the 1860s, they were still fighting 100 years later to establish their full rights as citizens. It was a struggle against deep-rooted racism and discrimination in schools, housing, and jobs. In the southern states, economic and political power was firmly in the hands of the whites. They used tests to stop poorly educated blacks from exercising their right to vote. The white racist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, stood for white supremacy. Wearing their sinister white robes, members of the Klan terrorized black people through beatings and lynchings. Local laws and customs separated blacks and whites in much of everyday life. Blacks were treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants as whites. Their children couldn't go to the same schools. The policy of separate but equal legalized this segregation, but separate rarely meant equal for the black community. Many blacks had moved to the northern cities to look for work, only to find another type of segregation in the urban black ghettos where regular jobs and adequate housing were hard to come by. This government film promoted the Federal Works Agency, which provided work for blacks hit hard by the economic depression of the 1930s.
Our only hope lay in charity. Hunger drove our people to the bread lines. Anxiously we waited for some sign of better days. Then came the federal government's work program. One by one, it took us out of the bread line. It gave us a new chance to take a normal place in the life of our community. It made us self-supporting. It changed the haggard, hopeless faces of the bread line into faces filled with hope and happiness, for now we work again.
The film's optimistic tone hides the fact that black unemployment was still far worse than for whites at the end of the 1930s. And if blacks joined the army, they found segregation there too. During World War II, 1/8 of the American army was black, but many of them were used in supporting roles and kept separate from white soldiers. Reacting to this discrimination, black Americans launched the Double V campaign. V for victory against fascism in Europe and against racism in America. In response, the American military made propaganda films to create the impression of blacks and whites fighting side by side. This film combines actual combat footage with specially shot scenes. Black soldiers are praised for their loyalty, despite the enemy's attempts to win them over.
These men needed each other. What would this man do? That's what this man wanted to know. We know now what he did. We know what they both did. And we know that they did it together. The price was not easy to pay, but they paid it.
The experience of 1 million black Americans fighting racism in Europe and Asia proved to be a turning point in the struggle for equality in America. Returning home to a country that was still strictly segregated, they joined black and white activists campaigning for an end to discrimination in what became known as the Civil Rights Movement. In 1954, the movement scored a major legal victory. The US Supreme Court overturned the separate but equal principle at the heart of school segregation. The southern states resisted what they saw as interference from the government in Washington. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas defied a court order to admit 9 black students to Central High School in Little Rock. News coverage of the confrontation exposed Southern racism to viewers around the world.
Little Rock, Arkansas, and the first phase of the trouble. The white population are determined to prevent colored students from going to the school their own children attend. Picketing the school, they clash with the police. The law of the land decrees integration of white and colored school children. But racial feeling still runs high in the southern states of America, as shown by these pictures taken by an amateur cameraman. The law of the land is rejected. A near riot developed, so the police made a number of arrests among the ringleaders of the white pickets. Later, the Central High School, Little Rock Storm Center, was sealed off by orders of the governor, who called out the State National Guard. Colored youngsters arrived under safe conduct by the guards. But no sooner had they arrived than they were off again. Arkansas had evidently decided to make its own laws on the subject of integration. Any colored person anywhere near the school came in for violent abuse, even if they now escaped physical violence. Phase 2, President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army to Little Rock by night. They are to keep order and to see that the law of the land is obeyed. White and colored students to go to the same school. The federal government clamps down on Arkansas. What Governor Forbes proposes to do next, apart from comparing Little Rock with Paris under the Nazis and Budapest under the Russians, remains to be seen.
The civil rights movement challenged all aspects of discrimination in public housing, transport, education and employment. The leader of the movement was Martin Luther King, a Baptist minister who used non-violent protest to confront white racism. In 1963, he helped to organize a march on Washington to put pressure on Congress, which was considering a bill on civil rights.
Just 100 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, 200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come by train, they come by bus and by air. They come from the north, the south, the east and west. They come united in one cause, to urge Congress to pass a civil rights bill to end forever the blight of racial inequity. You realize that in a sense they are participants in an historical day. It will become part of the American scene that today's gathering is the largest in Washington's history. The men who organized the rally walk with springing steps toward the speaker's stand. On the left, Roy Wilkins with A. Philip Randolph. They have fought their fight all of their adult lives. In the van is Martin Luther King, who has been jailed 12 times on racial issues. The theme, the keynote, the thought uppermost in minds of all here today is best set forth by Dr. King. He sums up a day the Capitol will long remember.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Washington, D.C., 1963. Democracy speaks in a mighty voice.
The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. It outlawed segregation in public facilities and racial discrimination in employment and education. But legislation could not change deeply ingrained attitudes overnight. The demand for integration provoked fierce hostility in many white communities, unwilling to share their neighborhoods with blacks. Television cameras were on hand to report violent confrontations.
Integration, however, has been a slow and very painful process. Almost everywhere it has met with white resistance.
Yes, I feel that the Bible teaches that the people shouldn't mingle. I mean, you can mingle, but I don't feel that they would integrate and live together. I think they should be separate. Even the animals choose their own breed. You don't see birds and animals all mingling with each other. They can be friends, but they don't have to be in with one another like that.
Faced with persistent discrimination, some blacks looked for more radical solutions. Malcolm X, a leading member of the Black Muslims, called for a separate state for blacks.
The sect based their teachings on the Muslim religion to pull American Negroes away from Christianity, the god of the white man.
It is the devil who leads you toward evil. Who makes the whiskey that you get drunk with? Who makes the cards that you gamble with? Who brings the dope into this country that you've become addicted to? Who has created the slum and the ghetto that you're living in? Nothing but a devil.
The speaker here is a self-confessed criminal, now reformed, a 36-year-old Negro who refuses to use his surname. Instead, he calls himself Malcolm X, and it's believed that he's the brains behind the Black Muslim movement. White Americans realize the Black Muslims bring an entirely new dimension to the race problem. Outside the courtroom, I asked Malcolm X, giving his first television interview, whether the Black Muslim prophet is preaching race hatred.
He's not teaching hate, he's teaching history. And since the American white man has used his control over the press and over the textbooks and over all forms of media to make it appear that he has done us a favor by bringing us here and enslaving us, then the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has to rewrite history or retell history. And since the white man can't dispute this truth, he tries to defend himself by saying that Mr. Muhammad is teaching hate. It's not hate to say that we were kidnapped and brought here, it's truth. It's not hate to say that we were Jim Crow, discriminated and segregated, it's truth. It's not hate to say that the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in this country, came up with a hypocritical desegregation decision 9 years ago, which they haven't enforced yet. That's not hate, that's truth.
In the mid-1960s, other black activists stepped up the pressure for change. They joined the increasingly militant movement known as Black Power. In 1967, there were race riots in 150 communities across America. Even less radical civil rights leaders, like Jesse Jackson, used Black Power as a rallying cry in the campaign to improve economic conditions for blacks.
This Buy Black campaign tries to get customers to buy products from Negro manufacturers and so keep their money in the black community. White supermarkets like this are boycotted by Operation Breadbasket if they don't stock enough black goods and hire enough black employees. Operation Breadbasket believes that black pride stems from black economic power, and the boycott is one way to get that power. Every Saturday morning, Operation Breadbasket meets in a Baptist church to hear its leader, Reverend Jesse Jackson. Jackson's sessions are a cross between a Negro revivalist meeting and a Black Power rally. He himself looks more like a black militant than a follower of Martin Luther King. Jackson wears the militant's badge, the Black Power Medal.
And I think that the black community is driving for economic independence, for political independence, for military independence, for social, for religious and psychological independence, which means that we will control our community as do other ethnic groups. And I think it might need to be brought out that independence precedes interdependence. The white community is separate, but it's separate and independent. The black community is separate, but it's separate and dependent.
In 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King rocked the civil rights movement, which split into many groups, each with their own demands. The extremists were now led by the Black Panthers, a small group of self-proclaimed revolutionaries who were committed to armed struggle against white authority. The Panthers hated the police as a symbol of white oppression. When their leader, Chairman Fred Hampton, was killed in a police raid, he became a martyr to the cause. His name is invoked by another Panther, Russ Meeks, in a speech filmed for British television.
Murderers of our young men, violators of our women, the spoilers of our community, be gone from our midst. For today we march with a new beat, with a new song, with a new rhythm, with a new memory. In the memory of Chairman Fred, as long as there is a drop of blood to be spilled in the name of the revolution, we must pledge ourselves to spill that blood in his name, to avenge, to never forget, to keep on in his memory, to let the beat get louder and stronger until it tears down the walls of oppression in our community. And we must say, death to our enemies, death to the oppressors of our people. We will kill if necessary, and we feel it's necessary to kill with strength, with determination. The beat goes on and on and on.
The Panthers tapped into the anger of a black community frustrated by continuing discrimination. But despite slow progress, a fundamental shift had occurred. Black power and black pride had given American blacks a new confidence.
Oh, you got that right, brother. Good morning, Chicago. Eddie Morrison here, and it's so nice to have you there. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Go ahead, James.
Say it loud.
I'm black and I'm proud.
I am optimistic now that I see black people standing up as black images rather than wanting to be white shadows. I am quite optimistic about black people because I know that there's a certain health and a certain capacity to love and a certain drive for peace and a certain integrity in the black community that perhaps I'm certain it has the power to heal itself, and the hope is that it will have the power to heal America as a byproduct.
At the end of the 20th century, many black Americans still suffered in poverty, and their political representation was still limited. But the civil rights movement had made a great leap forward. From the late 1960s, racial discrimination and segregation could never again be justified in law.